when you take kindergarten kids and put them on a bus for an hour and a half, when they got a school they could walk to 5 minutes away, now that's wrong.
I have consistently opposed forced busing to achieve racial balance.
For about a decade there, desegregating America's schools was the biggest political debate in the country.
Many of the Negro parents believe that a predominantly Negro school is inferior per se, but we do not believe that premise.
Mayors made and squandered their careers on it. Millions of families fled to the suburbs. Cities tore themselves apart. But now, in 2017, America's schools are more segregated than they were in the 1960s. The only difference is, white people don't think it's a problem anymore.
Tell us what arrangements you have made for us.
I grew up in Seattle. I want to tell the story of what happened here because I think it's instructive for understanding why segregation was the most urgent problem in America until it wasn't. Unlike the cities you usually hear about, there were never any riots here. No rock throwing, no protests. Like everything else, the racism in Seattle is extremely polite. But is that really the reason our schools are still so segregated?
No. Yes.
Alright, so in the beginning, the way it worked was every kid attended the school that was closest to their house. This sounds morally neutral, right? The simplest way of linking kids to the most convenient education. The problem was that Seattle, like every other city in America, forced its minority populations to live in specific neighborhoods. Kids attending their nearest school meant that geographic segregation became educational segregation. So, in a city that was only 3% black, one high school was majority African American, and the other 6 had fewer than 5 black students each. In 1977, Seattle announced that it was going to deliberately desegregate its school system. From now on, instead of going to the closest school, kids would be assigned to the school that would ensure racial balance across the city. White students would take buses to schools in the South End, and minority students would take buses north. What's surprising about this is that at the time, Seattle parents didn't actually kick and scream all that much. This is what happened in Boston after they announced a forced busing plan.
I am white and I want my rights.
In Seattle, though, most of the population wanted integration and supported the busing plan. Well, at least they did until it happened to their kids. Over the next 2 decades, tens of thousands of white parents quietly pulled their kids out of public schools. Here's what happened to enrollment as soon as the busing plan went into place. By 1990, nearly half the kids in Seattle were attending private schools, one of the highest rates in the country. Meanwhile, the public schools themselves went from hella white to barely white. Of course, an absence of white people is not in itself a crisis. But in Seattle, the schools depend on local levies for a huge chunk of their budget. You know those white parents that pulled their kids out of public schools?
Oh my God, Becky.
Each one of them was a voter who now had no interest in keeping the public schools funded at all. The district was afraid that if it couldn't get white parents back to public schools, it would start losing elections and its funding would be cut even more. So, starting in the 1980s, Seattle schools launched all sorts of gimmicks to lure white parents back to the district. They established magnet schools for STEM kids, alternative schools that didn't give grades or homework. And, especially, they set up programs within existing schools that separated the gifted students from the general population. Do I even need to tell you what kinds of kids got defined as gifted? By the 90s, it was clear the whole thing wasn't working. Minority kids were being bused an hour away from their homes, only to attend schools that were just as segregated as the city itself.
When they come up here, we won't mess with them, so why when we come up there, they mess with us?
Plus, despite the huge cost, busing wasn't actually narrowing the racial achievement gap, which was supposed to be the whole point. By the late 90s, the desegregation effort had been watered down to something called controlled choice. How it worked was, parents ranked the schools they wanted their kids to go to. If a school got more applications than it had spaces, the district was allowed to prioritize ethnic minority kids. That way, the schools in the rich neighborhoods wouldn't end up Munich in 1936. If this plan sounds modest, that's because it was. No one was forced to attend a school they didn't want to. White kids were just a little more likely to get their second choice than black kids were. But for some white parents, It was the last straw.
Pop your collars like this.
In 2001, a group of Seattle parents sued the district, saying their white kids were being disadvantaged on the basis of their race. The lawsuit eventually made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the justices agreed. Since the government didn't deliberately segregate schools in the first place, deliberately desegregating them amounted to discrimination. Remember this? The Supreme Court basically said it didn't happen. The court said it wasn't racist for schools to be divided by race, it was racist for the government to inconvenience white people by trying to fix it. Since the Supreme Court decision, Seattle has gone back to assigning kids to schools based on where they live. In a shocking twist, the district has ended up just as segregated as it was last time the city did this.
Becky, look at
But the most alarming thing about the re-segregation of Seattle schools is that it's getting more difficult to solve. In the last 10 years, Seattle has become one of the fastest growing cities in America. Rising housing prices have pushed poor and minority populations out of the city altogether. Except not like that, like this. 3 of the school districts right next to Seattle have student populations that are over 70% minority and where half the kids are on free lunch. Meanwhile, these 3 districts are mostly white kids and have almost no poor students at all. The same thing is happening in cities across the country.
New York State has the highest concentration of Black and Latino kids in schools that are less than 10% white.
The frustrating thing about this history is the lack of a clear villain. The parents who pulled their kids out of public schools when they got assigned to the South End, you can't really blame them. Of course they didn't want their kids to sit on a bus for an hour to go to an underfunded school. Who would? At the individual level, their choice to send their kids to a private school makes sense. At the structural level, though, when a whole city of white parents does the same thing, is exactly how racism happens. It's how it works. But it's not fair to let those white parents off the hook either. The reason those schools got no resources was racism.
The superintendent of schools has stated as his policy that a racially imbalanced school is not educationally harmful.
The schools with the most minorities got the least funding. That is not a coincidence. None of those white parents cared about the lack of resources for South End schools until their own kids were forced to attend them. Plus, once their own kids were in private school, they started voting against public school funding altogether. So yes, it's a little bit understandable, but it's also a little bit fuck these people. What happened in Seattle happened in every other city too. White parents don't like to think it's their fault desegregation failed. But looking back, is that the only reasonable conclusion?
No. Yes.